Commander Zethkar walked through the metal halls of Harmony Point Station. His heavy boots made loud sounds on the floor. The alien warrior stood 7 feet tall with thick gray skin covered in battle scars. Each scar told a story of fights across 3 different star systems. His people, the Velthari, were known as the toughest fighters in the galaxy. The station was busy with beings from many different worlds. Traders, diplomats, and military officers from dozens of species moved around doing their business. Zethkar had come here for a simple meeting about trade routes. Nothing important or dangerous. After 15 years of brutal war, he welcomed the break from combat. He entered the officers' lounge looking for a quiet drink. The room was dimly lit with soft music playing in the background. A few officers sat at different tables talking in low voices. Zethkar ordered a strong drink and found a table near the window that looked out at the stars. "Mind if I sit here?" a voice asked. Zethkar looked up to see a human male standing beside his table. The human was much smaller than him, maybe 6 feet tall with brown hair and kind eyes. He wore a simple military uniform without many decorations. "Go ahead," Zethkar said, waving at the empty chair. He had heard of humans but never met one before. They were new to the galaxy, having only recently developed space travel. The human sat down and extended his hand. "Captain Jake Murphy, Earth Naval Forces." Zethkar looked at the small hand for a moment before shaking it carefully. His large claws could easily crush human bones. "Commander Zethkar of the Velthari Imperial Navy." Jake smiled and ordered a simple beer. "Velthari? I've heard stories about your people. Great warriors, right?" Zethkar felt pride swell in his chest. "The greatest in the galaxy. We have fought in more battles than any other species. My scars alone tell the story of 50 major engagements." "Impressive," Jake said, taking a sip of his beer. "How long have you been fighting?" 15 years of active combat in the Kethmoran conflict," Zethkar said, his voice getting louder with pride. "We lost 30% of our military forces in that war. It was the most brutal fight our people had ever experienced. Entire planets were destroyed. Billions died, but we never gave up. We Velthari know how to endure pain." Jake nodded respectfully but said nothing about his own service. He just listened and asked simple questions about Zethkar's battles. "What about you, human? Have you seen combat?" Zethkar asked. Jake shrugged. "A little bit. I served for a while in what we called the Pacific Campaign." "Pacific Campaign? Sounds like a small regional conflict," Zethkar said. "How long did it last?" "About 4 years," Jake replied quietly. "Lost my brother at a place called Normandy. My father went down somewhere in the Pacific. Never found his body." Zethkar felt some sympathy for the smaller being. Losing family in war was something he understood. "I'm sorry for your losses. Regional conflicts can be very personal, even if they are not as large as major galactic wars." Jake just nodded and changed the subject. They talked about other things for the next hour. Jake told stories about his home planet Earth and asked questions about Velthari culture. He was polite and seemed genuinely interested in learning about other species. When Jake mentioned he had to leave for another meeting, Zethkar found himself disappointed. The human was pleasant company, unlike many of the arrogant officers he usually dealt with. There was something calm about Jake that Zethkar found relaxing. "Perhaps we can talk again tomorrow?" Zethkar asked. "I'd like that," Jake said, standing up. "I'll be here around the same time." After Jake left, Zethkar finished his drink alone. He thought about the quiet human officer. Jake seemed so young and soft compared to the hardened warriors Zethkar was used to. The human had probably seen a few small battles and thought he understood war. It was almost cute how modest he was about his service. Zethkar had fought in space battles with thousands of ships. He had seen entire moons crack apart from weapon fire. He had lost more friends than he could count, and had killed more enemies than he could remember. The Kethmoran conflict had shaped him into the warrior he was today. The next morning, Zethkar finished his diplomatic meetings quickly. The trade route discussions were boring compared to military planning. He found himself looking forward to seeing Jake again. It would be nice to talk with someone who would listen to his war stories without trying to compete with their own tales of glory. When evening came, he returned to the officers' lounge. Jake was already there, sitting at the same table with a beer in front of him. He waved when he saw Zethkar approaching. "How were your meetings?" Jake asked as Zethkar sat down. "Dull. Bureaucrats arguing about shipping costs and fuel prices. Nothing like the excitement of military planning." Zethkar replied. I prefer the clarity of combat to the confusion of politics. Jake smiled. Politics can be more complicated than fighting sometimes. They talked for another hour about various topics. Jake asked more questions about Velthari military tactics, which pleased Zethkar greatly. The human seemed genuinely interested in learning about proper warfare from an experienced commander. As the evening went on, Zethkar found himself curious about human military history. Jake had mentioned his father and brother dying in wars, which suggested humans had at least some experience with conflict. Tell me about this Pacific campaign, Zethkar said. What kind of weapons did your enemies use? How many ships were involved? Jake was quiet for a moment, looking down at his beer. It was mostly fought on islands and in the ocean. A lot of good people died for small pieces of land that most folks had never heard of. How many of your people were involved in this campaign? Maybe 16 million Americans served in that war. Worldwide, probably around 70 million people were in uniform at one time or another. Zethkar almost choked on his drink. 70 million? For a regional conflict? That seems like a very large number for your species. Jake looked up with a sad smile. Yeah, it was a big one for us. Zethkar could not stop thinking about what Jake had said. 70 million beings in uniform seemed impossible for what the human called a regional conflict. That number was larger than the entire population of most Velthari colony worlds. He decided to learn more about human warfare when he had time. The next day he met Jake again at the officer's lounge. The human looked tired, as if he had not slept well. When Zethkar asked about it, Jake just shrugged and said he sometimes had bad dreams about old times. War leaves marks on all of us, Zethkar said, understanding completely. He had his own nightmares about battles long past. Time helps, but the memories never fully go away. Jake nodded and took a long drink from his beer. My grandfather used to say the same thing. He served in the first big war, said the trenches never really left his mind. First big war? Zethkar asked. You mean there was another major conflict before this Pacific campaign? Oh yeah, Jake said casually. The Great War happened about 20 years before the one I fought in. Grandpa lost 2 brothers in France. Poison gas got one of them. The other died at a place called Verdun. Zethkar stared at the human. 2 major wars within 20 years? That seemed incredibly wasteful. Most civilized species needed at least a century to recover from a serious conflict. How long did this first war last? He asked. About 4 years. Killed maybe 20 million people. Wounded twice that many. They called it the war to end all wars, but obviously that didn't work out. Jake's voice was matter of fact, as if discussing the weather. 20 million dead in 4 years. Zethkar tried to process this information. The Kethmaran conflict, which had traumatized his entire species, had killed perhaps 5 million beings over 15 years. These humans had somehow endured losses 4 times greater in less than half the time. Then started another war just 2 decades later. Your people must be incredibly resilient, Zethkar said slowly. Jake looked surprised. I guess so. We just do what we have to do, you know? Can't change the past. So you deal with it and move forward. Over the next few days, their conversations continued. Each time they talked, Jake would mention some detail about human wars that shocked Zethkar more. He spoke of his great-grandfather who fought in something called the Civil War, where Americans fought against other Americans for 4 years. Brother against brother, Jake explained. Families were torn apart. Some battles had more casualties in a single day than most planets see in a lifetime. Zethkar began to realize that humans had been fighting massive wars for generations, not centuries like most species. Jake mentioned other conflicts too, wars with names like Korea and Vietnam, places Zethkar had never heard of but Jake spoke about as if everyone knew them. You humans seem to have a war for every generation, Zethkar observed. Jake thought about this for a moment. Yeah, I suppose we do. My dad fought in the Pacific, his father in France, his father in the Civil War. Going back further, there was the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War. Seems like there's always something happening somewhere. The casual way Jake discussed these conflicts disturbed Zethkar. For the Velthari, war was a sacred and terrible thing. They prepared for years, fought with religious intensity, and then spent decades recovering and mourning their losses. These humans seemed to treat warfare as a normal part of existence. That night, Zethkar accessed the station's database to research human military history. He wanted to understand how a species could fight so frequently and still function as a civilization. What he found in the computer files made him question everything he thought he knew about warfare. The humans had indeed been fighting almost continuously for their entire recorded history. But these were not simple tribal conflicts or border disputes. These were massive industrial-scale wars that consumed entire continents. He read about something called World War I, the Great War that Jake's grandfather had mentioned. The numbers were staggering. Millions of young humans had spent years in muddy trenches, charging across open ground into machine gun fire. Single battles lasted for months and consumed hundreds of thousands of lives for gains measured in meters. But it was World War II that truly horrified him. The conflict Jake had called the Big One involved nearly every nation on Earth. Cities were completely destroyed. Entire populations were murdered. The weapons used were so terrible that they could destroy everything within miles of impact. Zethkar read about battles like Stalingrad, where humans fought in the ruins of their own cities for months. He learned about D-Day, where thousands of young soldiers threw themselves against fortified beaches knowing most would die. He discovered the Holocaust, where humans systematically murdered millions of their own species. The scale of destruction was beyond anything in galactic history. Yet somehow these humans had not only survived but thrived afterward. Within decades of their most devastating war, they had developed space travel and were exploring the stars. When Zethkar met Jake the next evening, he looked at the quiet human with new eyes. This soft-spoken officer represented a species that had turned their entire planet into a battlefield multiple times, and somehow remained civilized. "Jake," he said carefully, "I have been reading about human history. These wars your people fought, they were not small regional conflicts." Jake looked up from his beer with a slight smile. "No, I suppose they weren't. World War II was pretty big, even for us. Your species lost over 70 million people in 6 years. That is more than died in the entire Kethmoran conflict. Yet you speak of it as just another war." "It was the worst one we've had so far," Jake said quietly. "But humans are good at bouncing back. We rebuild, we learn, and we try to do better next time." Zethkar shook his head in amazement. "How do you function? How does your society not collapse under the weight of such losses?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the stars. "I think maybe we've learned that giving up isn't an option. When everything falls apart, you either quit or you keep going. Humans don't quit very well." Zethkar could not sleep that night. Jake's words kept echoing in his mind. Humans don't quit very well. The simple statement seemed to hide something much deeper and more frightening than the human realized. He made his way to the station's data center in the early morning hours. The room was empty except for a few night shift technicians who paid him no attention. Zethkar settled at a terminal and began searching through the human historical databases. He started with the American Civil War that Jake had mentioned. What he found made his blood run cold. From 1861 to 1865, humans had fought each other with an intensity that shocked him. The Battle of Gettysburg alone had produced more casualties than the largest space battle in Velthari history. Over 50,000 humans killed or wounded in 3 days of fighting. But it was not just the numbers that disturbed him. It was the personal stories. He read letters from soldiers like Private Billy Thompson, writing to his mother from a battlefield hospital. "Dear Ma, I lost my leg at Antietam, but the doctors say I'll live." Tommy Cole wasn't so lucky. "Tell his wife I was with him at the end." These were not professional warriors bred for combat like the Velthari. These were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and clerks who had picked up weapons to fight their own neighbors. Young men like Sam Davis, barely 18 years old, who had volunteered to fight and died at places with names like Bull Run and Shiloh. Zethkar moved forward in time to World War I. The scale of destruction was even worse. Millions of humans had spent years in muddy trenches, living like animals while machine guns and artillery turned the ground between armies into a poisoned wasteland. He read about the Battle of the Somme, where British forces lost 60,000 men in a single day, not over weeks or months, but in one day of fighting. The battle continued for months afterward, grinding up entire generations of young men for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The personal accounts were heartbreaking. Letters from soldiers like Corporal Ryan Cole described conditions that would break elite Velthari shock troops. "The rats here are particularly repulsive. They are so fat. The kind of fatness that comes from feeding on human corpses, one soldier wrote to his family. But humans had not just endured these conditions. They had fought in them for years. They had charged across no man's land into machine gun fire, knowing they would probably die. They had held positions under artillery bombardment that would have shattered mountains. They had done this not once, but repeatedly, day after day for 4 years. Then came World War II, and Zethkar began to understand why Jake had called it the Big One. This conflict had consumed the entire human world. Every major nation was involved. Entire cities were destroyed by bombing. Civilian populations were murdered by the millions. He read about the Battle of Stalingrad, where humans fought in the ruins of their own city for months. Soviet soldiers like Lieutenant Tony Martinez had held positions in bombed-out buildings, fighting room to room against German forces. The battle lasted over 5 months and killed more than 2 million people. The Pacific War that Jake had fought in was equally brutal. Zethkar read about battles on tiny islands where humans had fought to the death rather than surrender. At Iwo Jima, American Marines had taken 70,000 casualties to capture an island only 8 square miles in size. The fighting was so intense that it took 36 days to secure a piece of land smaller than most Velthari military bases. He found records of individual acts of courage that defied belief. Sergeant Lisa Brown, a medic, had run into enemy fire 17 times in one battle to rescue wounded soldiers. Captain Pete Johnson had held a position for 3 days with no supplies, refusing evacuation orders because his men could not move. These were not superhuman warriors. These were ordinary people like Nurse Amy Clark, who had stayed with wounded soldiers even as enemy forces overran her position. Or pilot Carol Stevens, who had flown bombing missions over Germany knowing that most bomber crews did not survive their required number of missions. Zethkar read testimonies from prisoners of war who had endured years of torture and starvation without breaking. He learned about resistance fighters who had sabotaged enemy operations, knowing they would be executed if caught. He discovered that humans had continued fighting even when their cities were burning and their armies were surrounded. But what truly shocked him was what came after. Within years of their most devastating war, humans were rebuilding their civilization. They created new technologies, explored space, and built a peaceful society. The same species that had turned their planet into hell had somehow emerged stronger and more united. He found records of the Marshall Plan, where Americans had spent billions of dollars rebuilding the same countries they had just finished bombing. Former enemies became allies. Nations that had fought to mutual destruction worked together to explore the stars. As dawn approached, Zethkar sat back from the terminal with his mind reeling. Everything he thought he knew about warfare and courage had been shattered. The Velthari were proud of their military traditions, their honor in battle, their ability to endure hardship, but they had never faced anything like what humans considered normal. His own species had fought one major war in their recent history. It had lasted 15 years and killed perhaps 5 million beings. His people still spoke of it in hushed tones, still mourned their losses, still struggled to understand how they had survived such trauma. Humans had fought dozens of such wars. They had endured casualties that would have destroyed the Velthari as a species. They had seen their cities burned, their families murdered, their entire civilization threatened with extinction. And then they had gotten up, buried their dead, and started rebuilding. Jake's quiet words came back to him. We just do what we have to do. Such simple words to describe something so extraordinary. Humans did not just fight until victory or defeat like other species. They fought until everything was destroyed and then kept fighting. They fought in conditions that would make other species surrender immediately. They fought when outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded, and forgotten, and somehow they had remained human through it all. They still created art, still fell in love, still laughed at jokes, still showed mercy to their enemies. The same species that could turn their world into a slaughterhouse could also show incredible kindness and compassion. Zethkar finally understood why Jake seemed so calm and unimpressed by stories of galactic warfare. For a human, the Catamaran conflict would have been just another Tuesday. Zethkar found Jake at their usual table the next evening. The human looked the same as always, calm, quiet, unremarkable. But now Zethkar saw him differently. This was not just a soft-spoken officer from a peaceful species. This was a survivor of something far more terrible than anything the galaxy had ever known. Jake, Zethkar said as he sat down, his voice more serious than usual. I spent last night reading about human military history. Jake looked up from his beer with a slight smile. Find anything interesting? Interesting? Zethkar leaned forward, his large claws gripping the table. Your species has been at war almost continuously for centuries. How do you function? How do you build anything? How do you sleep at night? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I guess we don't think about it much. War is just something that happens. We deal with it, then we rebuild. What else can you do? Zethkar pulled out his personal datapad and showed Jake the casualty figures from the Kethmaran conflict. The numbers that had haunted him for years, that had made him a legend among his people for surviving. This was our greatest war, he said, his voice tight with old pain. 5 million dead over 15 years. It nearly destroyed us as a species. We lost entire fleets, whole colonies. I watched friends die in battles that lasted for days. The trauma still affects our entire society. Jake looked at the numbers respectfully, nodding as he read. Then he spoke quietly. That's terrible. I'm sorry your people had to go through that. But Jake, Zethkar said, his voice rising slightly, I read about your Battle of Stalingrad. Those same numbers represent about 2 days of fighting in that one battle. Jake was silent for a long moment. 2 days, he repeated softly. 2 days. Zethkar's voice was almost a shout now. Other patrons in the lounge turned to look at them. He lowered his voice, but the intensity remained. Your people lost more soldiers in 2 days than we lost in our entire war. And Stalingrad was just one battle in a war that lasted 6 years. Jake stared down at his hands. Yeah, Stalingrad was bad. My father's unit fought there before they transferred him to the Pacific. He never talked about it much. Zethkar felt something break inside his chest. This quiet human, this unremarkable officer, carried the weight of conflicts that would have shattered civilizations. His father had survived Stalingrad and then went on to fight in another theater of the same war. How? Zethkar asked desperately. How do you endure such things? How does your species not just give up? Jake looked up with sad eyes. Because giving up means everyone dies. When your back is against the wall, when your family is threatened, when everything you care about is burning, you don't get to quit. You fight until you win or until you're dead. But the cost, Zethkar whispered. The terrible cost. Yeah, the cost is high, Jake agreed. But what's the alternative? Let the bullies win? Let evil triumph because fighting back is too hard? That's not who we are. Jake began to talk about the war he had fought in, his voice still quiet but filled with pain. He told Zethkar about friends who had died on beaches with names like Guadalcanal and Tarawa. He spoke of Marine Jimmy Parker, barely 19 years old, who had jumped out of landing craft into enemy fire because that was the job that needed doing. We had kids, barely adults like Jimmy, throwing themselves at fortified positions, Jake said. We had engineers like Frank Miller building bridges under enemy fire because our tanks needed to cross rivers. We had pilots like Carol Stevens flying missions even when they knew they probably weren't coming back. Zethkar listened in growing horror and amazement. These were not the actions of trained warriors bred for combat. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary things because their survival depended on it. Susan Walsh was a nurse, Jake continued, 22 years old, volunteered to parachute behind enemy lines to help wounded resistance fighters. Got captured, tortured for months, never gave up any information. They executed her 3 days before the war ended. And you just accepted this? Zethkar asked. Your people just accepted that such sacrifices were necessary? What choice did we have? Jake's voice was firm now. Evil exists in the universe. Sometimes good people have to stand up to it, even when the cost is terrible. Someone has to be willing to pay that price, or darkness wins. Jake told him about the Holocaust, about entire populations murdered by their own government. He explained how humans had discovered the death camps and realized they were fighting not just for territory or resources, but for the very concept of human decency. That's when we knew we couldn't quit, Jake said. When we saw what happened when evil people got power. When we understood that surrender meant genocide, so we kept fighting no matter what it cost us. Zethkar thought about his own people's concept of honor in battle. The Velthari fought for glory, for territory, for the pride of their species. But humans fought for something deeper, for the right to exist, for the protection of the innocent, for abstract concepts like freedom and justice. Your father survived Stalingrad and then went to fight in the Pacific. Zethkar said slowly, He could have stayed home after surviving that hell. Why did he continue? Because the war wasn't over, Jake said simply. Because there were still people who needed help. Because someone had to finish the job. The simplicity of the answer hit Zethkar like a physical blow. Humans did not fight because they enjoyed it, or because they were naturally violent. They fought because they had to, because the alternative was worse, because someone needed to stand between civilization and chaos. We're not warriors by nature, Jake continued, as if reading Zethkar's thoughts. We're builders, farmers, teachers, parents. But when something threatens what we've built, when evil comes for our families, we become whatever we need to become. Zethkar sat back in his chair, feeling smaller than he ever had before. All his pride in his own combat experience seemed foolish now. He had fought in one war, against an enemy that followed the same basic rules of civilized conflict that his people understood. These humans had fought against enemies who murdered children, who destroyed cities for no strategic purpose, who committed acts of evil that most galactic species could not even imagine. And they had won. Not just once, but repeatedly. They had faced the worst that their own species could produce and had defeated it. They had turned their planet into hell and then rebuilt it into something better. I thought I understood what made a warrior, Zethkar said quietly. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, Zethkar returned to his homeworld of Velthara Prime. The journey gave him time to think about everything he had learned from Jake Murphy. The quiet human officer had changed something fundamental in how Zethkar saw the universe. When his ship landed at the military spaceport, crowds were waiting to welcome him home. News reports called him the hero of Kethmaran and the greatest living warrior of the Velthari. Young soldiers saluted him with obvious awe. Government officials wanted to shake his claws and be photographed with the famous commander. But Zethkar felt different now. The praise that once filled him with pride now seemed hollow. He smiled and waved at the crowds, but inside he was thinking about a species that had endured worse conflicts than his people could imagine, and somehow remained humble about it. The next day, he was scheduled to speak at a military ceremony, honoring veterans of the Kethmaran conflict. 5,000 soldiers filled the Great Hall, along with government officials and military leaders from across the Empire. They expected to hear the usual speech about Velthari courage and the glory of battle. Zethkar stood at the podium, looking out at the expectant faces. He had given this speech dozens of times before, talking about his own heroic actions and the superior fighting spirit of his people. But today he could not bring himself to say those words. My fellow warriors, he began, his voice carrying across the silent hall. I have always spoken to you about courage in battle, about the honor of our species and the glory we have won through combat. Today, I want to tell you about a different kind of courage. The audience leaned forward, expecting another war story from their greatest hero. I recently met a being from a species called humans. This being was quiet, soft-spoken, unremarkable in appearance. I thought I understood what he represented. A weak species that had fought a few small wars and thought they knew about conflict. Some members of the audience chuckled, expecting this to be a story about Velthari superiority. I was wrong, Zethkar continued. This species, these humans, have turned their entire planet into a battlefield multiple times and somehow emerged stronger each time. They have fought wars that make our greatest conflicts look like training exercises. The hall grew quiet. This was not the speech they had expected. Zethkar began to tell them about human warfare. He spoke of World War II, where 70 million humans had died in 6 years. He described battles like Stalingrad, where more soldiers died in a single engagement than in the entire Kethmaran conflict. He talked about young humans like Danny Lopez, who held a bridge alone against an entire enemy unit, and Amy Clark, who stayed with wounded soldiers even as enemy forces overran her position. These were not trained warriors bred for battle, he explained. These were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and students who picked up weapons because their families and their civilization were threatened. They endured conditions that would break elite Velthari shock troops. The audience was completely silent now. Some looked confused, others skeptical. Their greatest hero was telling them about another species that might be greater warriors than they were. I thought I understood war, Zethkar continued, his voice growing stronger. I thought our 15-year conflict made us the toughest fighters in the galaxy. But humans treat planetary warfare as a temporary inconvenience. They don't just fight until they win or lose. They fight until physics prevents them from fighting anymore. And then they start planning for the next war. He told them about the American Civil War, where humans fought their own brothers for 4 years, about World War I, where millions died in trenches for gains measured in meters, about the Pacific Campaign, where humans fought to the death on tiny islands rather than surrender. But here is what amazes me most, Zethkar said, his voice filled with genuine wonder. After each of these terrible wars, they rebuild. They create art, they explore space, they show mercy to their former enemies. The same species that can turn their world into hell can also show incredible compassion and forgiveness. A young officer in the front row raised his hand. "Commander, are you saying we should fear these humans?" Zethkar considered the question carefully. It was the same one his commanding officer had asked him privately after reading his mission report. "No," he finally answered. "They should be respected. Any species that can endure what humans have endured and still build starships, still create beauty, still laugh at jokes, still show kindness to strangers, they are not just warriors. They are survivors of the highest order." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "And if we are wise, we will make sure they remain our allies." The ceremony ended in uncomfortable silence. Many in the audience seemed unsure how to react. Their greatest war hero had just told them that another species might be tougher than they were. It challenged everything they believed about Velthari superiority. Later that evening, Zethkar sat in his quarters writing a message on his personal communicator. After several attempts, he settled on something simple. "Jake, thank you for helping me understand what real strength looks like. I hope our peoples can learn from each other. Your friend Zethkar." He sent the message across the galaxy to Harmony Point Station, knowing it would take weeks to reach the quiet human officer who had changed his entire worldview. Over the following months, Zethkar found that his new perspective affected everything he did. When young officers came to him for advice about combat, he told them about human tactics and human endurance. When politicians spoke of Velthari military superiority, he quietly corrected them with stories of human sacrifice and determination. Some of his fellow officers thought he had been somehow damaged by his experiences. They could not understand why their greatest hero kept talking about aliens instead of celebrating their own achievements. But younger officers began to listen more carefully to his stories about humans. One evening, as Zethkar stood on his balcony looking up at the stars, he received a reply to his message. It was brief, like everything Jake wrote. "Zethkar, glad we could talk. Humans have a lot to learn from other species too. Maybe someday our kids won't have to fight the wars we did. Stay safe out there. Jake." Zethkar smiled as he read the message. Even in his reply, Jake was thinking about the future, about building something better for the next generation. That was perhaps the most human thing of all, the ability to endure terrible hardships while never losing hope that tomorrow could be better than today. As he looked up at the stars, Zethkar no longer saw them as battlefields to be conquered. He saw them as frontiers to be explored, worlds to be built, homes for species that had learned to survive anything the universe could throw at them. And somewhere out there, a species called humanity was probably already heading for those distant suns, carrying with them the same quiet determination that had helped them survive every hell their own world had created. If the galaxy was lucky, humans would share more than just their toughness with the rest of the universe. They might also share their ability to rebuild, to forgive, to hope, and to keep moving forward no matter how dark things became. That, Zethkar realized, was the real lesson Jake Murphy had taught him. Warriors were made by necessity, but survivors were forged by choice, and humans, more than any species he had ever encountered, had chosen to survive.